In the year 1793, a king knelt in a public square in Paris. Tens of thousands of people watched in silence. A blade fell, and in that single second, 1,000 years of monarchy ended. But here is what almost nobody tells you. That king was not the beginning of France's story. He was barely the middle of it. Long before there was a France, there were people on this land who painted lions on cave walls by firelight 36,000 years ago. There were warriors who made Julius Caesar bleed. There was a teenage girl who heard voices, put on armor, and changed the fate of an entire continent. There were kings who called themselves the Sun, and emperors who conquered most of Europe and then lost everything in the snow. This is not just the story of a country. It is the story of how a wild, divided, blood-soaked patch of Western Europe became one of the most powerful, beautiful, and influential nations the world has ever seen. This is the story of France from the very beginning to right now.
To understand France, you have to forget France. There was no France, no language called French, no flag, no Paris. There was only the land, a fertile, river-laced corner of Europe that humans have been fighting over for tens of thousands of years. Deep in the south, in a cave called Chauvet, our ancestors left behind some of the oldest art on earth. Horses, rhinos, lions, drawn with a skill that would not be matched for thousands of years. These people had no written language. We don't know their names, but they were here, and they were us. By around 500 BC, this land had a name the Romans would give it, Gaul. And it was home to a people the Romans called the Gauls. Fierce Celtic tribes, hundreds of them, scattered across forests and hills. They were farmers and warriors, metalworkers and traders. They drank, they feasted, they fought each other constantly. They were not a nation, they were a storm of tribes.
And then came Rome. In 58 BC, a Roman general with unlimited ambition crossed into Gaul with his legions. His name was Julius Caesar. Over 8 brutal years, Caesar conquered the Gauls in a campaign so violent that by some ancient estimates, 1 million people died and another 1 million were enslaved. But the Gauls did not go quietly. In 52 BC, a young chieftain named Vercingetorix did the impossible. He united the warring tribes against Rome. For one shining moment, Gaul fought as one. At the fortress of Alesia, Vercingetorix made his last stand against Caesar himself. He lost. Caesar surrounded him, starved him, and crushed him. Vercingetorix surrendered, was paraded through Rome in chains, and was eventually executed. But he became something more powerful than a king. He became a legend. To this day, the French remember him as their first national hero. The first man who tried to make these tribes into one people.
Gaul became Roman. For nearly 500 years, this land spoke Latin, built Roman roads, Roman arenas, Roman cities. The DNA of France, its language, its law, its very name was being forged in the fire of Rome. And then Rome fell. When the Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, the order it had imposed vanished. Into that vacuum poured the so-called barbarian tribes, Goths, Burgundians, and one tribe that would give this land its name forever, the Franks. That word, Frank, would eventually become France. The country is literally named after them. The Franks found their leader in a ruthless, brilliant warlord named Clovis. Around the year 500, Clovis did two things that changed history. First, he conquered and united the Frankish tribes into a single kingdom. Second, and this was the masterstroke, he converted to Christianity. By becoming Catholic, Clovis won the loyalty of the Church, the only institution that had survived Rome's fall. That alliance between the crown and the cross would define France for the next 1,300 years. But Clovis's descendants were not Clovis. Over the next 2 centuries, the dynasty rotted. They became known brutally as the do-nothing kings, figureheads who sat on thrones while real power slipped to their advisors. The kingdom was drifting.
And then, in 732, the world nearly changed forever. An army of the expanding Islamic Caliphate had swept across Spain and pushed north into Frankish lands. At the Battle of Tours, a Frankish commander named Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, met them. And he held. He stopped the advance cold. Historians still argue about how close Europe came to a different destiny that day. But one thing is certain. Charles the Hammer became a giant. And his grandson would become the most important figure in early European history. His name was Charlemagne, Charles the Great. He was a conqueror who expanded his kingdom across most of Western Europe, a reformer who revived learning and art in an age of darkness, and a ruler so powerful that on Christmas Day in the year 800, the Pope himself crowned him Emperor of the Romans, the first emperor in Western Europe since Rome had fallen 3 centuries before. Charlemagne is claimed by both France and Germany as a founding father. His empire was the seed from which both nations would grow. But empires built by one great man rarely survive him. After his death, his grandsons tore his empire apart. And from the western half of that broken empire, something new began to take shape. The kingdom of the West Franks. The kingdom that would in time become France.
The Middle Ages in France were an age of contradictions, of soaring cathedrals and savage wars, of holy faith and brutal power. In 987, a nobleman named Hugh Capet was elected king. He was not the most powerful lord in the land, far from it, but his family, the Capetians, would cling to the throne with extraordinary patience, passing the crown from father to son for over 300 years. Slowly, generation by generation, they expanded the king's power from a small territory around Paris into a true kingdom. This was the age that built Notre Dame to Paris, Chartres, the great Gothic cathedrals whose stained glass still stuns visitors 8 centuries later. It was the age of the Crusades, when French knights marched east in the name of God. In fact, in the Middle East, Europeans were so often led by Frenchmen that locals sometimes called all crusaders simply the Franks. But France's medieval story has one chapter that towers above all others, a war so long it is measured not in years but in generations. It was called the 100 Years' War, and it actually lasted even longer than that, over a century of on and off conflict between the kings of France and the kings of England, who claimed the French throne for themselves. For decades it went badly for France. The English won crushing victories. At Agincourt in 1415, a smaller English army annihilated the flower of French nobility in the mud. Half of France fell under English control. Paris itself was lost. The French crown was on the verge of total collapse.
And then came the most unlikely hero in all of history. A peasant girl, 17 years old, illiterate, from a tiny village. Her name was Joan of Arc. She said she heard the voices of saints, telling her that God had chosen her to save France. By every measure of her time, this should have been laughed out of the room. Instead, against all odds, she convinced the desperate French prince to give her an army. And then she won. At Orleans, she lifted a siege the French had thought hopeless. She rallied a broken nation. She marched the prince to be crowned king in the Cathedral of Reims, exactly as tradition demanded. In a matter of months, a teenage girl had turned the entire war around. But her story does not have a fairy tale ending. Joan was captured, sold to the English, and put on trial. They called her a heretic and a witch. In 1431, at the age of 19, she was burned alive at the stake in Rouen. Witnesses said she asked for a cross to hold as the flames rose, and called out the name of Jesus until the end. She died believing she had saved France, and she had. Within a generation, the English were driven out. France was whole again. And 5 centuries later, the church that burned her would make her a saint. Joan of Arc remains, to this day, the eternal soul of France.
By the 1600s, France had become the most powerful kingdom in Europe, and it would soon be ruled by the most extravagant monarch the world had ever seen. His name was Louis XIV, and he called himself the Sun King, because, like the sun, he believed everything revolved around him. Louis took the throne as a child and held it for an astonishing 72 years, the longest reign of any monarch in Europe history. Under him, France became the cultural capital of the world. French became the language of kings and diplomats across the continent. French art, French fashion, French food. Everyone wanted to be like France. And at the center of it all, Louis built a monument to his own glory, the Palace of Versailles. Versailles was not just a palace. It was a machine for power. Louis forced his most dangerous nobles to live there with him, trapped in a golden cage of etiquette and ceremony, so busy competing for his attention that they had no time to plot against him. He turned the proudest aristocrats in Europe into glorified servants, fighting for the honor of handing him his shirt in the morning. It was genius, and it was monstrously expensive, because while the king dined on golden plates, the people of France were starving. Versailles was paid for by crushing taxes on the poorest people in the kingdom, the peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population. The nobles and the clergy paid almost nothing. The system was rotten at its core. Louis XIV famously is said to have declared, "I am the state." There was no France apart from the king. The king was France, but he was building something he could not see. Every gold fountain, every royal feast, every unfair tax was another log on a fire that would one day consume the monarchy entirely. Louis died in 1715, leaving France glorious, indebted, and dangerously unequal. His successors inherited the debt and the arrogance, but not the genius, and the fire kept growing.
By the 1780s, France was a powder keg. The country was bankrupt. Decades of expensive wars and royal extravagance had drained the treasury. The harvests failed. The price of bread, the food the poor depended on to survive, soared beyond reach. People were literally starving in the streets, while the court at Versailles danced.
On the throne sat King Louis XVI, a well-meaning but weak and indecisive man, and his queen, the Austrian-born Marie Antoinette, who became a symbol, fairly or not, of everything wrong with the monarchy. The whole of French society was divided into three estates: the clergy, the nobility, and then everyone else, the third estate, over 97% of the population, who paid nearly all the taxes and held almost none of the power. In 1789, with the country collapsing, the third estate had enough. They broke away and declared themselves the true voice of the nation, the National Assembly. They swore an oath not to disband until France had a constitution. The revolution had begun. On July 14, 1789, a Paris mob stormed the Bastille, a royal fortress and prison that symbolized the king's absolute power. They tore it apart with their bare hands. That date is still celebrated as France's National Day. Then came words that would echo around the world. The revolutionaries issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man, proclaiming that all men are born free and equal in rights, liberty, equality, brotherhood. It was a direct challenge to 1,000 years of kings ruling by the grace of God.
For a moment, it seemed France might become a peaceful constitutional monarchy. It did not. The revolution spiraled. The king tried to flee the country and was caught. Foreign armies massed on the borders to crush the revolution and restore the monarchy. Paranoia and fear swept the nation, and power fell into the hands of radicals who believed the revolution could only be saved through blood. This was the reign of terror. Its instrument was a machine designed to kill swiftly and humanely, the guillotine, and it never stopped working. In January 1793, King Louis XVI himself was marched to the scaffold and executed before a crowd of thousands. A king of France beheaded by his own people. Months later, Marie Antoinette followed him to the same blade. The terror was led by a man named Maximilien Robespierre, incorruptible, fanatical, and utterly convinced he was building a perfect society. Under him, tens of thousands were executed, often on the flimsiest accusations. Friends denounced friends. Fear ruled everything. And then, as revolutions so often do, the terror devoured its own. Robespierre was overthrown, arrested, and sent to the very guillotine he had fed for so long. The man who unleashed the terror died by it. France had killed its king, torn down its ancient order, and drowned in its own blood. It was exhausted, broken, leaderless. It was the perfect moment for a man on horseback to seize everything.
His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. He was not even really French by birth. He was born on the island of Corsica, and as a boy he spoke with an accent his classmates mocked. But he was perhaps the greatest military genius the world has ever produced. Napoleon rose through the chaos of the revolution as a brilliant young artillery officer, winning victory after victory. By 1799, with France desperate for stability, he seized power in a coup. Within 5 years, he did the unthinkable for a revolution that had killed its king to abolish monarchy. He crowned himself emperor, and then he set out to conquer Europe. He was staggeringly successful. At Austerlitz, considered his greatest victory, he destroyed a combined Austrian and Russian army through sheer tactical brilliance. He defeated nearly every major power in Europe, placed his relatives on foreign thrones, and at his height controlled or dominated most of the continent.
But Napoleon was more than a conqueror. He reshaped France from the inside. He created the Napoleonic Code, a unified system of law that swept away the chaos of the old regime and guaranteed equality before the law. That code still forms the backbone of the French legal system today and influenced legal systems across the entire world. He reformed education, finance, and administration. In many ways, he built the modern French state.
But ambition has a limit, and Napoleon found his in the snows of Russia. In 1812, he invaded Russia with the largest army Europe had ever seen, over 500,000 men. The Russians refused to fight him directly. They retreated, burning everything behind them, drawing him deeper and deeper into an endless, empty land as winter closed in. By the time Napoleon reached Moscow, the city was abandoned and in flames. There was no victory to be had. And then came the retreat, through one of the deadliest winters imaginable. Starvation, frostbite, constant attacks. Of the more than 500,000 men who marched into Russia, only a small fraction staggered back out. It was a catastrophe from which he never recovered. Napoleon's enemies united, defeated him, and exiled him. He escaped, returned to France, and raised one final army, only to be crushed for the last time at a place whose name became legend, Waterloo, in 1815. This time there was no return. He was exiled to a tiny, remote island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, where he died 6 years later, alone. He had risen from nothing to rule a continent, and lost it all. But the legend of Napoleon and the modern nation he forged would outlive him forever.
After Napoleon, France could not decide what it wanted to be. For the next 60 years, the country lurched violently between systems of government. Kings returned to the throne, only to be overthrown again. Another Napoleon, the first one's nephew, declared himself emperor, and then lost a disastrous war to a rising new power, Germany, in 1871. Revolution after revolution shook the streets of Paris. And yet, out of all that turmoil, modern France was being born. Paris was rebuilt into the city of grand boulevards and elegant architecture we know today. The Eiffel Tower rose in 1889, mocked at first as an iron monstrosity, now the most beloved symbol of France on earth. This was the era the French call the Belle Époque, the beautiful era, a golden age of art, science, and culture, with Paris as the dazzling capital of the Western world. But the new century would bring horror on a scale never seen before. In World War I, France became the main battlefield of the Western Front. The fighting that tore across French soil killed nearly 1.5 million French soldiers. An entire generation of young men was wiped out. At Verdun, one of the longest and bloodiest battles in human history was fought on French ground, leaving the land so scarred that parts of it remain uninhabitable to this day. France survived, victorious, but bled white.
And then, just 2 decades later, came World War II. In 1940, Nazi Germany invaded and conquered France in a matter of weeks. The Nazi flag flew over Paris. It was one of the darkest moments in the nation's history. But France did not entirely surrender its soul. A general named Charles de Gaulle escaped to London and broadcast a message of defiance, calling on the French to resist. Across the country, ordinary people joined the resistance, risking torture and death to fight the occupation from the shadows. In 1944, the Allies landed at Normandy on D-Day, and France was liberated. Paris was free again. Out of the ashes of war, France rebuilt itself once more.
Under de Gaulle, it founded the Fifth Republic, the system that still governs France today. It let go of its vast colonial empire, often through painful and violent struggles, especially in Algeria. And it chose a new path, not conquest, but cooperation. France became one of the founding architects of the European Union, helping to bind together the nations that had spent 1,000 years tearing each other apart.
From cave painters by firelight 36,000 years ago, to a chieftain who defied Rome, to a teenage girl who saved a nation and burned for it, to a sun king who built a palace of gold, to a people who beheaded their own king in the name of liberty, to a Corsican who conquered a continent, to a nation that survived 2 world wars and rose again. This is France. Not a country that was simply given its greatness, but one that fought, bled, burned, and rebuilt itself again and again across thousands of years. The story of France is the story of how people refuse to disappear, how they fall and rise and fall again and somehow always remain unmistakably themselves.